Okay, good afternoon and welcome everybody to the seventh of the seminar series, What Were We Thinking? In this particular episode, I'm delighted to welcome Alex Pennington with his talk, Coming Back to Our Senses, How Art Can Shape the Future of Medicine. So Alex is actually a practicing counselor in Cape Town and has been for a number of years. And so in relation to his work, Alex writes, I believe the mainstream of therapy is love. And he also states, sometimes it takes a little darkness to get us going, which I think are both beautiful sentiments that perhaps reflect a reframing and a movement away from the pathologizing of experience and the medicalization of suffering, and offers us something of a different perspective or a different way of seeing things and reframing the therapeutic environment. So in this slide, Alex is going to talk us through a discussion on how art in particular may function as an anti-bullshit tonic to the usual sort of modus operandi, if you like, of the therapeutic environment. So without further ado, I'm delighted to listen to Alex and see what he has to say about how art can function and reframe for us. So whenever you're ready, Alex.
Thank you so much, Emma, and I really appreciate the introduction.
Oh.
So the presentation is going to be about 40 minutes. The screen has stopped sharing. Let me just quickly address that, because I think I know what the problem is.
Excellent.
Okay. This should work. There we go.
There we go.
Right. Okay. Gazing across starlit space, one can feel a rising sense of awe. This is how astronomy, the older science, was born. With a telescope, we can see regions of outer space that were once unimaginable 1,000 years ago. With the microscope, it was impossible to see deadly bacteria that were also unimaginable 200 years ago. So with the microscope, it was possible to see deadly bacteria that were unimaginable 200 years ago, excuse me. Those tools help change the way we understand our place in the known universe and the cause of profound sources of suffering and death because of what they allowed us to see and thereby name and describe. The task of this talk is not discovery, but to throw old tools in a new light, because these are the tools that are not ordinarily found in medicine, even though they are essential for our health. To show this, I'm going to draw a connection between the history of tuberculosis and the history of treatment for depression. And to do this well, I have to go into the history of tuberculosis in quite a lot of detail, because I think having a very clear image of this history and how medicine managed to cure what is the deadliest disease known to humankind can do a lot more to help us clearly see how the science of psychiatry and psychotherapy have gone awry than examining those histories in isolation, which is a very common practice. And part of the reason why I'm so compelled by psychiatry and psychotherapy is that they are practices which are inextricably intertwined with the most important moral concerns of our time, which has to do with the nature of suffering and how to respond. And it is the case that a person goes to see a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist not because they are sick, but for a reason that is largely outside the remit of ordinary medicine. And when the traditional medicine reaches into those concerns, sometimes it can go awry, and this limits our powers to respond to some of the most important questions about health today. And what are some of those questions? The Harvard study of adult development, which is the longest study on human health ever, recently published its findings that close relationships are the strongest predictor of our health, more than IQ and genes. If medicine is a tradition that seeks to nourish, protect, and care for our health, then complex interactions among people are as important for our health as complex interactions among genes, if that isn't already monumentally obvious. But what tools would medicine need in order to adequately respond to the questions raised by this study? I'm going to talk about some of the tools that have helped medicine succeed in astonishing fashion and show how those tools just don't work as well in the context of psychiatry and psychotherapy. Now, this presents more of a challenge than you might think. If medicine is going to adopt these tools, because medicine relies on what I think is a really important thing, which is that it is so powerful because it is able to identify abnormal conditions in the body. And I think I borrow this from Joseph McManus, who's a historian, and he was also a physician, because it helps me at least, to understand where medicine has made breakthroughs and where it struggles to make the same kind of breakthrough. So without further ado, I didn't edit that, but sorry. Sorry, don't worry about the truth connection, laughed a bit, but just to express some gratitude. A lot of the ideas that I draw are from John Green's excellent work, Patrick Kelly's deep dives into medical history, Professor Anne Harrington's work on the science of psychiatry, and Professor Sonu Shamdasani. Much of their work is given a different flavor or edited as part of this presentation. If you want a genuinely lovely book on the role of Black nurses in curing TB during the Jim Crow era and what it's like to be alive between the transition point of disease and cure, I highly recommend Maria Smiliosa's book, The Black Angels. Of course, thank you to the co-hosts of this lovely series, my fellow co-presenters for their work, and for those who are here. I'm also grateful for medicine and the people who risk themselves to care for others. Also the creatures who have had to endure miserable lives so that human beings can live better ones. In all, thanks to medicine, I and my loved ones have been spared a kind of suffering that is difficult to imagine and appreciate, but this was not the case in the 1800s. Medicine could not do much for people at this point in time, not much by way of cure, and certainly not much by way of explanation, but you had a hell of a time if you had a toothache. And while people may have looked forward to getting toothaches in this part of history, it was truly, truly miserable if you got TB. So this painting is called The Misery by Cristobal Rojas, a Venezuelan realist. And people at the time did not call TB because they didn't know what it was caused by. And so they had to use other reference points, such as what it felt like and how it affected the body, which was almost to consume it from within. And so it was given the name consumption. Aside from the incredible skill of this painting, what I admire about it so much, aside from portraying how incredibly painful it is to die from TB, it is that disease rarely affects a single person, and those who love someone who is very sick and gravely ill are unlikely to be spared. In the face of something that is so obviously terrifying and powerful, what is a surprising human response? As for one possible answer, this is a poem that is written by Kurt Vonnegut, which goes something like this. Tiger got to hunt, bird got to fly, man got to sit and wonder, why? Bird got to sleep, bird got to land, man got to tell himself he understand. I'm going to borrow John Green's interpretation of this poem, which is, if there's no reason to be found, if there's no cause and effect relationship that is present, one is going to be made up, even if it is cruel and even if it is wrong. For instance, an English monograph on consumption in 1846 states that consumption is a contagion is so entirely without proof that I should not be justified in occupying any time by seriously considering it. This is a phrase that really didn't age well. Across the Atlantic, we also find a similar statement. It goes like this. I know of no disease in which we have so marked an exhibition of the doctrine of hereditary transmission as consumption, when the mode of keeping medical statistics in this country shall become more uniform and perfect, they will show hereditary in at least 1/2 of all who perish with the disease. So in other words, people had quite a strong idea of what the cause of consumption actually was, and that was something you inherited through your genes. So how did people go from being ignorant to understanding what the cause of TB actually was, amidst all these very intense debates around the cause and treatment of consumption? After cobbling some money together, Emma Fraatz asked her husband, the anonymous Dr. Robert Koch, what he would like for his birthday. He could have a carriage to more easily visit his patients, or a microscope. Robert Koch, altering the history of medicine forever, then chose the microscope. With this, he could see that an animal who had died from a widespread disease called anthrax teemed with other life forms, which at the time were called animalcules, but later called bacteria. Now, lots of people had seen this kind of thing before, but it wasn't clear that this was the cause of a disease because it could easily have been its result. And how did Koch get past the stalemate? He did an experiment. He took blood from the sheep that he had presented with and put it in the microscope. Then he cultured the bacteria using the liquid of a dead cow's eyeball. And he took that culture, then injected it into a mouse that he found in a barn at the back of his house, and did this again and again and again, and proved what is called a chain of transmission. And this meant that Koch had turned a germ theory into a germ fact. In the course of his experiments, we have the white lab mouse. Koch's lab assistant at the time, Julius Petri, invented the Petri dish. And so through this, what emerged were the very early rules and tools of scientific experimentation, or what is called today in vitro science, in vitro meaning in glass. Koch then tested this method against the deadliest disease known to humankind. If Koch could isolate the bacteria and then eventually prove a chain of consumption, he would have disproved the prevailing theory that this was genetically inherited and proved that it was also an infection. When Koch presented his work to the Society of Physiology in Berlin in 1882, there was no applause, no murmuring, no debate. The crowd was simply and utterly speechless. So at the end of the 19th century, when Koch's findings were replicated, the era of consumption and inherited tradition ceased to exist. And the era of tuberculosis, a disease caused by a bacterial infection, had commenced. So Koch found the first piece of the puzzle, the cause of tuberculosis. But the debates did not end there because Koch had not found all the pieces of the puzzle, all the tools in the shed, and the next piece would have to do with treatment. Even after Koch had found the cause of TB, doctors were very wary of discarding proven methods. As a centennial piece addressing the state of medicine in 1901 claimed, after Koch had made a discovery, we have ascertained that in reality, drugs play not a conspicuous or clearly visible part in the cure of disease. Thus, we know the most important part of the treatment for tuberculosis is an abundance of fresh air and good nutritious food. So it's sort of repeating age-old wisdom of 1,000 years. As you can see with this French poster, when people recovered, they were encouraged to exercise afterwards and wear as few clothes as possible to maximize the therapeutic benefits of sunshine and air. And of course, it's not true. It's helpful because if your immune system improves, it can sort of fight back TB, but it's not strictly true. And so what this meant is that while sanatoria and dispensaries to try and stop the spread of tuberculosis came in full force, those who were in sanatorium and dispensaries often died. More than half of TB patients died, no matter how clean the air they breathed, or how much they exercise, how still they lay, or how few clothes they wore. Still, there were some improvements. The process to diagnose TB at the time was called microscopy. Someone would spit into a cup and someone else would analyze that sample to see if traces of TB were present, but this method of diagnosis would often miss patients with TB, especially children. When the X-ray showed up, it was much easier to diagnose early signs of the disease. And this just naturally improved outcomes. So after Koch's discovery, one of the very important goals was to create a treatment that could use the differences between human cells and bacteria, such as the fact that human cells have cell membranes while bacteria have cell walls, to make medication that would harm bacteria but not harm us. And this led to the discovery of penicillin in 1928. The rise of penicillin, as you can see in this sort of timeline, plays an important role in the birth of the modern American pharmaceutical industry. Why? Because what would happen to soldiers in the time of World War II if they got wounded and then those wounds were infected? They get gangrene, and cocaine certainly can't solve that kind of problem. The penicillin was extremely difficult to make in large quantities, and labs just simply couldn't produce enough to cure practically anyone. And so the United States government and private companies teamed up to try and bolster the war effort, and things moved very fast after that. As an indication, in 1941, barely anyone had access to penicillin. In 1943, a whole army could be supported, and in 1945, you could get it at your local pharmacy. Now, as you can imagine, during those years, the process of drug discovery changed, large-scale production transformed the pharmaceutical industry, which was not a profitable industry at the time. It was less profitable than cars, men's clothing, which I found surprising, as well as jewelry. And so in a sense, this changed forever the therapy for infectious diseases. And of course, because penicillin couldn't cure TB, there'd be plenty of antibiotics to come. So the myco in Mycobacterium refers to the mycolic acid in its cell wall. In other words, it is a highly fortified cell, and that's why it's not similar to other infectious diseases, because it takes a very long time to create another version of itself. And that's why it also can't be cured by penicillin. But without a treatment for TB, TB was still the world's leading infectious disease, was the leading cause of death and disability, and millions of people were still residents of sanatoria and dispensaries well into the 1940s. It was in the lab of a soil microbiologist by the name of Selman Waxman and his two employees, Albert Schatz and Elizabeth Bougie, who found a microbe that offered potential to treat TB. And after conducting a successful trial on guinea pigs, that would be later called streptomycin. But to test streptomycin on human beings led to an innovative research design at the time that would later become the gold standard for medical research, otherwise called the randomized controlled clinical trial, or as I've titled it, trickle treatment. And this was to kind of like ward off any bias and to ensure that the effects of the treatment were located to the treatment and not sort of some other outside influence. When the RCTs were conducted with streptomycin, it was quite clear that it was effective, but it wasn't a cure. And so in the 1950s, you still had hospitals and labs trying to look for really effective treatments. And there was one sanatorium called the Seaview Sanatorium in the 1950s that conducted a trial in secret, because at that stage, the sort of general awareness was that miracle cures could just be around the corner. And so to ward off any unnecessary public furor, the Seaview Sanatorium tried to keep it under wraps. And welcoming patients in certain wards, the wards being 11 and 13, which is an important detail later, would get given the first dose of isoniazid and isoniazide's derivatives, one of them called marsalid. And that's an important thing to remember in a couple of slides. And these medications are made by Hoffman and Roche, also important. So, patients who months before had been condemned to spend the remaining years of their life in hospital wards were beginning to be discharged. And the trial's results were an obvious cause for celebration, but naturally the news broke out. And when the news broke out, you had people flock to the Seaview Sanatorium in 1952, and instead of encountering figures like those in Cristobal Rojas's paintings, they encountered people who were literally dancing in the halls of Ward 13. This photo obviously becomes extremely famous because they are the polar opposite to the figures of those depicted by Rojas. It spread to all corners of the United States since the Seaview Sanatorium was located there, and the photograph received particular interest from a psychiatrist called Nathan Klein, who was also the director of research at Rockland Hospital. Klein, joined by several other interested colleagues, persuaded the pharmaceutical company responsible for producing this medication, Hoffmann La Roche, to let them test Marsalid on patients suffering from severely depressed states, or what was otherwise called then endogenous depression, which at the time was an extremely rare condition. And during the spring of 1957, in a meeting with other members of the American Psychiatric Association, Klein and colleagues reported what the results were of a clinical trial that they had done with Marsalid. And they had shown that it worked quite well. So Klein insisted, along with his researchers, that psychiatry needed a drug like this. They persuaded Hoffmann La Roche, as well as the FDA, the major regulatory arm of the United States government, and the drug very swiftly came into the market later that year as the first recognized treatment for endogenous depression. But what Klein and his colleagues had not found, because they obviously wouldn't be interested in the nurses' notes, and the nurses who monitored the patients on these drugs noted how on higher doses of Marsalin, high doses of Marsalin were causing mania bordering on psychosis. So it wasn't exactly a safe treatment. Okay, so let's get our bearings before we get onto the history of treatments for depression. So from the results of these trials, the synthesis of new antibiotics in the 1950s, and all the scientific, technical, and industrial infrastructure in place, and the development of RIPE guidelines, and the RIPE guidelines have inspired this drawing of the orange, because to help doctors and patients remember that they need to take all these different antibiotics, an image of ripe fruit comes to mind. Now the deadliest disease in humankind is curable. And so the contemporary issue with TB is not strictly the science, it's to do with human problems. But unlike the history that I've given you about tuberculosis, the history of depression does not begin with a discovery of a disease. It is a history of treatments. And without this discovery, even if depression is a disease with an unknown cause, in analogous terms, depression as a word is much more similar to consumption prior to the 1880s than tuberculosis after the 1940s. And why do I say so? Because the very process of diagnosis remains totally fraught, which was not the case for tuberculosis. In an interview with Robinson Earhart, a philosophy graduate in Stanford University, Professor Anna Lemke, who's also a practicing psychiatrist, spoke about the pretense of psychiatry. While discussing the relationship between science and psychiatry, Lemke explains that psychiatrists rely on highly controversial diagnostic categories, largely because they are required for insurance purposes. Quote, if you put a patient in a room with 10 psychiatrists, you can get 10 different diagnoses. These are very subjective types of interpretations. And of course, psychiatrists can and do disagree. When it comes to getting reimbursed by a third party, it has to be a DSM diagnosis to get reimbursed. And Earhart, her interviewer, later questions this. And to quote him, okay, if you put a patient in a room with 10 psychiatrists and you get Lemke interrupts him by saying, "Oh, I see you're stuck on that," and then sort of tries to laugh it off. Earhart brings it back and says, "Well, I'm stuck in it because I think it should be intuitively troubling that this is what happens if you give a patient to doctors who hold this very important place in our society. We go to them for our biggest problems, which are our health problems, and if we get 10 different answers, that suggests a startling lack of consistency," to which Lemke replies, "Oh yeah, we just have to admit that it's not exactly science that we're doing." In the quote in the bottom, I've referenced an important scholar, Tanya Luhrmann, who says, which echoes Joseph McManus's earlier point about abnormalities. You can't see mental illnesses directly like a runny nose or objectively like a fever, which is important because this comes long after the treatments of depression are used. But Lemke's words are not exactly comforting, given that she is one of the leading voices of psychiatry at one of the top medical and scientific institutions in the world. And so when a profession like psychiatry and psychotherapy cannot describe the kind of disease or disorder it aims to treat, then all the other tools don't work as well as they did with tuberculosis. And these tools are treatments, trials, and ultimately, if those two things work well, better treatments. And so I'm going to briefly show you how, with the absence of a clear description, things become pear-shaped. But I'm going to start with where we got this very powerful idea about what depression is. So true to medicine as a tradition, what it is going to look for in the science is some kind of abnormality. So in 1965, after Klein and co. have developed these treatments for endogenous depression, the CHAD hypothesis comes into play, which is an abbreviation for the catecholamine hypothesis of affective disorders. So this comes from a paper in 1965 by Josef Schildkraut. I had to ask Anja, my German girlfriend, how to pronounce that name. This Schildkraut is very careful about saying this is a hypothesis, this is not an explanation. And the term catecholamine, just as a quick word of explanation, serotonin and norepinephrine both contain a chemical group known as the catechol, and they are both monoamines. And for this reason, these neurotransmitters were named as catecholamines. So in that article describing the CHAD hypothesis, Schildkraut reviewed all the previous research. He reviewed the animal studies, the clinical trials with imipramine and iperonizid, studies that showed increased catecholamine levels in the blood and urine of people taking antidepressants. He also looked at, I mean, we're getting into a bunch of neuroscience terms, but he did a full blown review of the current research. And he concluded with an important but tentative proposal, which if you can read along with what I've written. This hypothesis, which has been designated the CHAD, proposes that some, if not all, depressions are associated with an absolute or relative deficiency of catecholamines, particularly norepinephrine, at functionally important receptor sites of the brain. Schildkraut's article would become the most frequently cited paper ever published in the American Journal of Psychiatry. 2 years later, he collaborated with Seymour Ketty on another article published in Science that refined the original hypothesis, arguing strongly for seeing norepinephrine rather than serotonin as the neurotransmitter that regulated mood. The hypothesis, which would provide a theoretical focus to pharmacological research, would provide a theoretical focus for the next quarter century. And as I mentioned, he was very, very careful about emphasizing that it was no more than a hypothesis. But as research goes, it tends to spread outside of academic institutions and then goes into the public. And that's where the chemical imbalance idea comes from. Now, what sort of buffers the controversy, as you remember from what the microscope introduced to medicine, new imaging technologies around the 1980s began to emerge, such as the positron emission tomography. This is a PET scanner that I found, and of course the MRI, or magnetic resonance imager. And this gave psychiatrists and medical practitioners more generally new confidence that they'd be practicing a bona fide branch of medicine. Because if researchers could do more than take static images of the brain, but create snapshots of the brain in action, then practitioners could see what was going on with mentally ill patients, like cardiologists who use angiograms to identify blockages to blood flow. The psychologist Kay Redfield Jamison describes the appeal of what brain scanning methods introduce to the field. Quote, "There's a beauty and an intuitive appeal to the brain scanning methods, especially the high-resolution MRI pictures and the gorgeous multicolored scans from the PET studies. With PET, for example, a depressed brain will show up in a cold, brain-inactive, deep blue color, dark purples, and hunter greens. The same when hypomanic. It will be lit up like a Christmas tree, with vivid patches of bright red and yellows and oranges. Never has the color and structure of science so completely captured the cold inward deadness of depression or the vibrant, active engagement of mania." Now, this wasn't sort of observations. This was a prediction of what the scans would look like. And so how did these new technologies eventually cash out for treatments? Turns out not that well. So Thomas Insel, who's the director of the world's largest funded body of research in mental health, the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States, captures a sense of professional despondency. To quote, "I spent 13 years at NIMH really pushing on the neuroscience and genetics of mental disorders, and when I look back, I realized that while I think I succeeded at getting lots of really cool papers published by cool scientists at fairly large costs, I think 20 billion, I don't think we moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness, and I hold myself accountable for that." And I mean, this kind of makes sense, because if you can't pick out the abnormality that treatments are supposed to target, naturally treatments aren't going to work that well. So there's a very, very basic timeline of treatments for depression. Without the cause, treatments tend to go pear-shaped. Now, what was also going on at the time were randomized controlled trials looking at what is the most effective treatment. And there's this really interesting passage in, at the time, what was the biggest randomized controlled trial that was planned by the NIMH, where in describing sort of the background of how to plan this RCT, that the authors didn't consider that the theoretical debates around what depression is or how to treat it were that important to consider, and they were only considerate after the RCT trial had been done. And so I've included a quote which says quite directly by Elkin and colleagues who administered the trial, "This article will not focus on current theoretical issues related to the nature and treatment of depression. Such issues will be addressed once data are available from the outcome study." So let me just quickly get, the RCT compared 4 16-week-long treatment conditions for depression, 2 psychotherapies, 1 being cognitive therapy and sort of a standard interpersonal therapy, placebo and medication. 250 patients were involved, 20 as well as 29 psychotherapists. And these new psychotherapy treatments were tested against what was the standard of care at the time, which was an antidepressant called imipramine. And so depending on the results, it's obviously raised quite profound questions about the biology of depression, because if a psychotherapy could do just as well as depression, well, then that raises further questions about what depression is. So in the context of randomized controlled trials, which developed out of trying to find a cure for tuberculosis, the trial came after two major discoveries. The first discovery, as we know, which is Robert Koch in 1882, and the second, which was the idea that antibiotics could target the treatment. Obviously, through trials and testing, those drugs were improved. But in the context of psychotherapy, where the cause is so controversial as to what depression is, and because the cause isn't clearly defined, treatments can't then clearly target the cause. And so what happens then when you start to use what is considered the gold standard research design in medicine, when you don't have those other two discoveries set in place? So I'm going to read a quote by the New York Times when the findings from that RCT were published. It goes as follows. A long-awaited major study has concluded that two important forms of psychotherapy are as effective as standard drug treatment in curing depression, a mental order that afflicts millions of Americans. But sort of, as I mentioned before, under the kind of circumstances, which were completely different circumstances to the treatments for depression, those kinds of findings can only be confounded because you don't exactly know what the cause of the thing that you're trying to treat is, and you're not exactly sure how treatments work exactly. And so you end up with the gold standard of medicine essentially being used to provide evidence for any kind of treatment, which essentially means that we just simply get more and more treatments for the same thing. And so this is just a collection of what you could possibly do or what you could be recommended to do if you had depression. And what has made the problem even more complicated is that within these different treatments, you get different kinds of treatments. So these are just the range of possible medications you could take for depression, the range of psychotherapies that you could do for depression. And so it becomes just enormously confusing, even more confusing about what depression is. And so instead of the trials lending light on the nature of treatments and psychotherapy, it just makes it more confusing. But my concern is that if we rely on a tradition to provide the facts that we need to tell the truth about our suffering, these traditions just make it more difficult to tell the truth rather than less difficult. And if it is more difficult to tell the truth, it becomes much more difficult not only to be in touch with others, but also with ourselves. And this is the precondition for a very profound sense of loneliness. And despite how technology has put us within shouting distance of almost everyone, loneliness has become an increasing concern. And what we learn from the Harvard study of adult development, and what we learn from other researchers like Dr. Vivek Murthy, loneliness is the background of many major health concerns. And what we learn from Hannah Arendt, a political philosopher, is that loneliness is the background of the most frightening and terrible sources of hatred and indifference. So it seems to me in all that the branches of medicine, like psychiatry and psychotherapy, that could otherwise be very well disposed to address this problem are not that well disposed. And so I think what can be done is to rescue much older tools that predated the microscope, which have otherwise been cast aside and left neglected to help deal with this problem. And what tools are these? So just a shout out to Simone for sending me this article, otherwise I never would have come across this. The passage is from a poet called Judy Hogan. So Judy Hogan says that one of the tools that we could use to rescue the situation is poetry. Poetry can show us the difference between the lingo of the advertisers, the abstractions of psychologists, the misnomers of big government bureaucracies, and what is really happening. Poetry can, with a mystic accuracy, name what we feel and why. She can shoot light without special ray guns through a morning bank of clouds and get directly to us, our hearts, our guts, our own inner knowledge. She can reach across all the fake and sham and unreal things and relationships with which our days are crowded and say what she means and say it with authority and clarity. So if poetry has the power to accurately describe what goes on in our internal lives, that's one power of poetry. But there's another power of poetry in what it can give us access to. And it may give us access to experiences that we would otherwise never imagine having. And Alfonso Lingus, one of my favorite philosophers, very clearly describes another tool that can give us access to these realms. And so to quote him, fiction gives us access to a higher realm. Certainly one of the biggest themes of the novel has been love. I think so many ordinary people, young people, even older people, would never aspire to the fullness and depth of love if they hadn't had access to its true fiction. So MacIntyre is making, another philosopher, quite a serious comment, and I haven't been able to draw the connection between this very clearly, but I think the rise of medicine has meant that Alistair MacIntyre's conclusion speaks for itself, that the cost of the increased power of psychiatry and in some forms of psychotherapy has meant that our society has become poetically impoverished. And so MacIntyre is then very seriously engaging with the question of, okay, well, if we have an poetically impoverished society, what do we do about that? And this will be the last bit of the presentation. Poets have as the principal task of telling memorable stories. It is only through listening to those stories that their audience are able to learn important facts. But what kinds of facts are these? On the view that I am describing, those facts need to be presented through the poet's storytelling and grasped through the poetic imagination. If I try to characterize them in plain and unimaginative prose, I am bound to fail. The most I can do is gesture to what poets say. So it's very curious that Alistair MacIntyre, one of the most important living philosophers today, acknowledges that even his discipline cannot articulate the things that poets might be able to articulate. So he carries on. The facts of this kind of poet communicate concern the following: what it is to win and what it is to be defeated, what it is to be at home in the world and what it is to find oneself a stranger, what the ties of friendships are and what it is to be condemned to friendlessness, what we owe to the living and the dead. We can expand these bare descriptions a little, but only a little bit more. For what the stories told by such poets provide are not illustrations of some set of formulas or generalizations, as though we could grasp the truth independently of these poems. And in this talk, Alistair references this obscure or forgotten figure called Frank O'Malley, who was part of the English department at Notre Dame. Because then the question raises, well, if poetry gives us access to certain things, how do we access it? Because there are loads of people who read poetry and just are completely unaffected. And so then he goes into O'Malley's pedagogy, which I think is very interesting to think with. O'Malley's students were largely the children of immigrants, whose parents in the course of their journey to the United States had separated themselves from much of their own life and culture, be it Italian, Polish, Irish, and besides. But they were also separated from what poetry provided: a shared memory, a means for the expression of deep and complex emotions, and a stock of stories through which their grasp offers forms a meaningful life. So how would O'Malley nourish these students? It was O'Malley's contention, a contention on which he staked his life as a teacher, that what his students needed were the resources of a poetic and literary imagination, resources only to be learned by relearning how to read. How did O'Malley teach his students how to read? O'Malley taught his students how to read by also learning how to write. As part of assigned essays in freshman composition and rhetoric, he required expressions of things seen, heard, tasted, touched, or felt. Expressions rescued from the tired, unthinking, and unfeeling uses of language. This cultivated a self-awareness of our everyday uses of language because as we learn how to express ourselves, we also learn how to imagine ourselves as well as others. And we learn from the great works of imagination across history. So O'Malley's pedagogy sensitizes students to the aesthetic and ethical dimensions of language and of life, which would birth a kind of imagination capable of dreaming into another's world accurately and creatively. So one could say O'Malley nourished minds capable of being responsive to many different kinds of works of art, because he helped his students, literally and figuratively, to come back to their senses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. Okay, what a fabulous talk. I'll give everybody a chance to ask questions and raise their hands to pose any comments or questions to Alex. You know, I'll just quickly say, I'll jump in just for 30 seconds, Alex. What came to mind, what sprung to mind, lots of things sprang to mind, but have you ever heard of Rosenhan's study, being sane in insane places? I remember having to teach it when I was lecturing in psychology many years ago, and essentially this psychiatrist became an anti-psychiatrist because he noticed that in psychiatric units, people who were admitted under diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia found it incredibly hard to leave again, and he sent a bunch of so-called sane individuals in. And they were all kept in, and everything they did was labeled as schizophrenic, whether or not it had any sort of relationship to what was known about the that disorder at the time. And so if it was a pivotal study, I thought you might find interesting that kind of showed the difficulty or the problems associated with diagnostic and statistical manuals and all of this reductionism. So I just thought you might find that interesting. But you know, I really respect the way that you went and you took the history of tuberculosis, which I believe is still a leading cause of death in South Africa amongst you know, lowest socioeconomic groups at least. So there's a lot going on there. Hey, there's a lot about accessibility as well as everything else. And also what you talked about seemed to represent moving more towards terrain theory and away from germ theory. So more looking at what kind of factors, relational factors impact on various forms of disorder, whether they be mental or otherwise, as opposed to looking for one single linear cause and effect relationship. So those are just my little 2 cents. The Rosenhan study and yeah, terrain theory as opposed to germ theory come to mind. Do we have, I need to check the chat. Would anybody like to pose a question or make a comment to Alex? I'll just give everybody a second. Okay, Gary, I think we see your hand up. Yeah.
Alex, thanks very much for that. I think maybe it follows on in terms of Emma's comment, is just that in terms of depression, it was seen as a disease, not as something else. And using the golden standard for a disease as the natural course of doing things, and it works if it's a disease, if it's bacteria, but the assumption that depression is a bacteria is not necessarily correct, you know, and that would that be a correct view? You know, so the problem in terms of because we want to treat depression, you know, so when you use the term treat, you mean application of something that cures, you know, and I'm not sure that maybe depression isn't that, maybe depression is something else. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear your views.
So firstly, Emma, thank you for your suggestions and comments. So Gary, I just want to get clear on your question. Do you mean that the way that I described depression was that depression is a bacterial infection? Okay, no. And then the second part of your question, what if depression is not something that you can treat medically? It's just sort of like a more existential condition. Am I sort of hearing you properly? Because I got a little bit.
No, I'm just wondering that the lack of success in terms of treating depression could be associated with the fact that it's viewed as from the germ perspective or the disease perspective, and so the continual reliance on medicine as the treatment option, whereas that's not what's happening there. But it doesn't necessarily negate the TB, the bacteria, the disease, the COVID, whatever it be. It's just that we're using one tool, one view to view everything, whereas we should be using different microscopes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. So I tried to make sense of how medicine has been astonishingly successful. And I think that's important to emphasize in the time in which we live, where there's so much skepticism and distrust. And I've also tried to sort of locate some of the sources of that distrust, because people are very aware that this, people aren't stupid, that if the science is not great, people can figure it out eventually. But then there's this kind of dogmatic approach that because something worked in the past, it has to work well in the future. And I think that does mean treatments aren't so successful, but I also think the science can be improved, but people are not asking the right questions as to how it can be improved. And I think we need different tools to ask better questions. But if we rely on the same tools, they may work for one kind of problem, but they're not going to work. They don't necessarily work as well for the other. And yeah, I suppose with depression, understanding depression other ways, one of my friends said what I thought was such an insightful thing about depression, which doesn't rely on medicine at all, relied on distinguishing it from what a sensitive person is and what a depressed person is. And a sensitive person still able to feel very deep sources of despair. So Anton Chekhov was famously, he checked into a psychiatric clinic. But a person who is depressed can only feel pain. They can't feel the joys or the excitement or love of life. And that's very serious. And that is not, I mean, look, sometimes people experience profound relief with medication, but I think because it's so unknown what the biological causes are, if you're trying to rectify a biological cause and the problem is to do something, has to do with something else entirely, that might cause a lot more trouble. And so now psychiatrists are not so confident about prescribing medication so willy-nilly. But I think it's a very serious concern that GPs have access to prescribing medication, because it takes a very, very long time to understand why someone is depressed when there's no clear biological explanation. And gosh, we really need people who can listen to someone, speak for the time that it takes to understand the reasons for their depression, because there are reasons. And I suppose in part, maybe it's a problem of language as well, that depression has become a catch-all for so many different things. But yeah, I'm rambling a bit. Does that sort of answer your question, Gary? Okay.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Sorry to interrupt. Thanks, Alex. I do see Andrea would like to put her hand up, but it's not
okay, thanks. I don't have that put up hand function as the host, so
no
Thanks, Alex. Fascinating, really interesting talk. So just a quick question, and that would be to do with maybe complexity, that sometimes there are medical conditions that are associated with depression, or depression is associated with those medical conditions, and it's very difficult to separate the two. So there's no amount of poetry that would ever help certain conditions. You need meds. It's just it's a question. So maybe a much more kind of hybrid approach would be important, that you would have to kind of look at both the kind of the underlying chemical conditions, whatever they are, and actually sometimes they do need to be kind of treated with, I don't know, meds. I'm no doctor, I have no idea, but I get the impression that it's definitely not an either or, because the condition is so complex.
Well, yes. So, so just to say, people have experienced deep relief taking antidepressants. I've seen that in the course of my own life. But even if that is the case, it doesn't mean that we know it works for the reasons it's said to work, which is to restore chemical imbalance. And so now, for instance, some folks are talking about how it enhances neuroplasticity, but even that is very ambiguous, because you find neuroplasticity in patients who've experienced stroke. So if the brain releases neuroplasticity in response to stroke, that doesn't seem to bode well for antidepressants releasing neuroplasticity, because neuroplasticity is obviously a good thing, but we don't know exactly what antidepressants are doing, which is what I was trying to say in the presentation, that the science is just so confused. And if the science is confused, and the treatments, well, the treatments are going to go awry. So some people experience relief, and that's a truly magnificent and wonderful thing. But some people, their lives don't change. Others, their lives become much worse.
Yeah.
And what's becoming another serious issue is that there's a lot of literature coming out on the withdrawals from antidepressants. So if you've been using antidepressants for more than 2-3 years, going off the antidepressants becomes a serious issue, because then you fall into, well, what the literature once said, a relapse. But what is the relapse into exactly if we can't describe the thing that the treatments are for? And so what that means is withdrawal symptoms haven't gotten much attention. And so you'll go back on the medication, often for many more years. And that's an enormous problem that hasn't received much attention and should receive a lot more attention. Because what it would mean is, given these withdrawals are so serious, that you would have to sign an indemnity form to go on the medication if you wanted to take it for more than a few months. But what would that do for the confidence of doctors prescribing it, or the confidence of people taking it? The dangers aren't exactly clear, and I think the dangers need to be made clear. But yeah, certainly it can work for some. But, and then in this discussion as well, because the poetry thing is not, oh, if you read poems your whole life, you're going to be swell.
No, it's definitely not bad.
Okay, cool. Yeah. But it's more what poetry offers to us. Because again, if there was a discovery of depression, I'm all, wonderful. Then I could put in a nice little history, nice little neat timeline. That would be so great. But it's very difficult to do that. And I think that's done something very profound to our language and how we describe our own sources of suffering. And in my own life, I've found the resources of fiction and literature and poetry profound. Profound to describe the ways that we treat each other, or the way that we are treated by other people. And then it gets into sort of a more ethical imagination of the reasons that we can suffer so terribly. And Bessel van der Kolk, who's a psychiatrist, a very well-known psychiatrist, who's sort of written a very important book on this topic called The Body Keeps a Score, which is more on depression, less on trauma. One of the things he says about, or talks about, is that when we only speak about the science, we don't actually get to speak about the terrible things people do to each other. And if what is behind depression or behind schizophrenia or behind all these other major mental health categories, trauma, is that people are hurting each other, then I think medicine must be able to respond to that if it is so important that we have close relationships. And obviously that has political implications as well. But yeah, I didn't get to, there was already so much, didn't want to get into that. But thanks, Andrea, it's a nice question.
Just to finish off there, Alex, see Belinda Deploy's comment up there is very fitting to what you were just saying, where she says, makes me think of Dead Poets Society. Mr. Keating, John Keating, we don't read and write poetry because it's cute. We read and write poetry because we are members of the human race. And the human race is filled with passion. And medicine, law, business, engineering, these are noble pursuits and necessary to sustain life. But poetry, beauty, romance, love, these are what we stay alive for. So, yeah, I think that rounds things off quite nicely there to sort of reiterate that sentiment of, I think maybe what we're talking about is the nature of the human condition in its entirety, you know, and we're hurting each other perhaps, and maybe also, you know, this eco-psychologists also think that we're suffering low-grade traumatization because of how we're hurting the planet and all of its beings too. So it all fits together, I think, yeah.
And on that point, so thank you, Belinda. That's a wonderful comment. It's not just, you know, poetry is not, an art is not important, not because it's able to describe how we're hurt. It also opens us into realities of love that I don't think medical language can, because it's so concerned with disease, and I don't think it needs to. But I really wonder that I mean, I wonder in the true sense that mediums of art can open us to possibilities that are unimaginable. And I think this is in part what spiritual practices also try to achieve. Sorry, Gary, I can see your hand.
Thanks.
I was going to try and get in another question before we shut. I don't know if I may.
Yeah, we started late, so.
No, it's just, Alex, you know, as you were talking through the treatment of TB and how people came together and government worked with private industry to try and cure it, and etc. I was struck by the most recent Surgeon General choice in America of a person who's not a surgeon being chosen to head up that thing, and it's this. I don't know how to describe that field, but the sort of wellness industry might be a way to describe it. And I was just wondering if you had any views on where medicine, why that's become so popular. You know, the sort of anti-science view, the anti-gold standard view, we can't, you know, so the vilification of Fauci, for instance, you know, I mean, I've seen people calling him evil, and you know, he's always struck me as a sort of gentle scientist, you know. Now, I mean, who's crazier, me or the people calling him evil, you know? And it's a little bit difficult to understand this movement away from science as the gold standard, not you know, yeah. So I was just wondering if you had some views on that.
Gary, if you struggle to understand it, then I'm definitely not going to understand it. Gosh, I mean, where to start? I mean, yeah, the thing that really disheartens me about someone like RFK, just the new Surgeon General. I mean, I don't even know actually where to start with him, but just in the sense that, because no doubt he's played quite an important role in funding cuts. So huge bodies of scientific research have, you know, can't do their otherwise extremely important work because the NIH is such a big funder. And especially with TB, because TB does develop treatment-resistant strains. And so one of the major issues now is that because the treatments have very powerful and often very negative side effects, it's difficult to stay on them. And so we've had programs that, help TB patients stay on their medication. And the funding cuts essentially not only mean that many people are going to die, and unnecessarily, because we know how to cure it, but treatment-resistant strains are going to develop, which is going to put us more at risk. So it's kind of like I just see him as a horseman of like the apocalypse. He seems to celebrate. Yeah. As for the wellness thing, my mind is just so buzzed at the moment from the presenting. I can't actually answer you well. But again, Gary, if you're confused about it, then I'm definitely going to be far more confused than you. But it's an important thing to figure out.
Well, thanks so much, Alex. Are you good, Gary?
Thanks, James.
Yeah.
No, we need probably another entire session to
Yeah,
talk that one through.
I'm steaming.
Hey, babes, something went wrong with payment, so I am heading to you now. My credit card is ready at Nedbank, which is also at Pick and Pay. So I think we need to do that
Just
quickly,
mute.
because then I've got a working credit card as opposed to messing around with this virtual shit. I can, we can look at all the conversions and just now.
Sorry, I
but
can't get to this
about
person.
20 minutes, bye.
Sorry,
Okay.
Alex.
No worries. That's one of my colleagues, Toby,
No
who's
problem.
such a wonderful person and a wonderful academic. So no worries.
Can you just share his credit card details, please?
Oh, thanks, Murphy, for rearing your ugly head there again. I think this will wrap us up, if everyone's okay to say goodbye. Alex, thanks again so much for your presentation. I loved it, and I'll be chewing on that information for quite a while. And I guess we'll say goodbye, and we'll see you next week. I'm sorry, Andrea, I don't actually know who we have next week.
Matthias, is it
I'm sorry, I put you on the spot. That doesn't help either.
That's
Anyway,
okay.
we're back next Friday for sure.
We'll be back next Friday, and I'm pretty sure it's Matthias. Or
Yes, it is.
am I?
It is. Yeah.
Yay!
Yay!
No
Yay!
panic. No panic. I haven't
Fabulous.
cancelled yet.
No, good. No, yeah, yay. Looking forward
allowed.
to it. So yeah, we'll see you next week, and yeah, everyone have a great weekend.
Great weekend. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Alex. That was great.
Thanks again, Alex.